Tokyo, December 1945. The war had ended 4 months ago, but Michiko Tanaka could still smell the smoke in the air. At 43 years old, she had never known a man's touch. In pre-war Japan, this would have been unusual, but Michiko's story was one of sacrifice that thousands of Japanese women understood too well. Her father had been a teacher, a man of strict Confucian values who believed daughters should be modest, obedient, and patient. When Michiko turned 20, marriage proposals came. But then her mother fell ill with tuberculosis, and the family's savings vanished into medical bills. The proposals stopped. No man wanted a wife who came with debt and a dying mother. Her mother lingered for 7 years before passing in 1929. By then, Michiko was 27, already considered past her prime in a society that valued youth and fertility above all else. The whispers had started. At family gatherings, aunts would exchange glances. "Still unmarried," they would murmur, the words carrying judgment heavier than stones. What a waste. The neighbors were less subtle. Old Mrs. Kobayashi next door openly called her the daughter who missed her season, as if Michiko were produce left too long on the shelf. Her younger sister married at 19 and had 3 children before Michiko turned 30. At every family celebration, relatives would ask the same poisonous question. "And you, Michiko-san? Still no prospects?" The subtext was clear. She had squandered her youth on duty, and now she would pay the price with loneliness. By 35, people stopped asking altogether. She had become invisible, a cautionary tale mothers told their daughters about waiting too long. If you're enjoying this story and want to see where Michiko's journey leads, please consider subscribing and leaving a like. It helps us bring more untold stories like this to light. Thank you for being here. The war years had been brutal in different ways. Her father died in an American bombing raid in 1944. Food became scarce. Michiko worked in a textile factory, her hands bleeding from 12-hour shifts making parachutes for kamikaze pilots. She watched younger women marry soldiers before they shipped out, desperate unions that often ended in telegrams and widow's weeds. At least, she told herself, she would never receive such a telegram. At least, she would never know that particular grief. But after the surrender, a different kind of shame arrived with the occupation forces. American soldiers flooded Tokyo, tall men in clean uniforms who walked through the rubble with cigarettes and chocolate bars. Japanese women who associated with them were called pan-pan girls, a slur that dripped with contempt. Michiko watched from her window as neighbors shunned girls who smiled at GIs, as fathers disowned daughters who accepted stockings or canned food. The message was unmistakable: better to starve with honor than survive with disgrace. Michiko worked now as a clerk in a requisitioned government building, processing ration cards under American supervision. She kept her eyes down, spoke only when necessary, and took a different route home each evening to avoid the bars where soldiers gathered. She had spent 43 years being invisible. She intended to remain that way. But fate, as Michiko would learn, cared nothing for intentions. It was a Wednesday afternoon when she met Sergeant James Crawford. The heating system in the administrative office had failed, and Michiko was tasked with guiding the American engineer through the building's basement. She bowed stiffly when he arrived, avoiding eye contact as custom dictated. "Ma'am," he said, his voice surprisingly gentle. He was tall, taller than any Japanese man she'd known, with dark skin and careful eyes that seemed to apologize for taking up so much space. He carried his toolbox with both hands, as if trying to make himself smaller, less threatening. Michiko led him down the narrow stairs into the cold basement, pointing to the furnace without speaking. She turned to leave, but he stopped her with a question in halting textbook Japanese. "Please stay, I may need help." She hesitated. Being alone with an American soldier violated every survival instinct she'd developed, but orders were orders. She nodded and stood near the doorway, arms crossed against the December chill seeping through the concrete walls. Crawford worked in silence for 20 minutes, occasionally glancing back as if checking that she hadn't fled. Finally, he spoke in English, then translated slowly. "This will take time. You must be cold. I have coffee in my bag." He gestured to a thermos. "No, thank you," Michiko replied in English, surprising them both. She had studied the language before the war, though she'd hidden this fact for years. Speaking English during wartime could invite suspicion. Speaking it now felt like a small rebellion. Crawford's eyebrows rose. "You speak English?" "A little." She kept her voice flat, neutral. He smiled, not the predatory grin she'd seen on soldiers downtown, but something softer. "Then maybe you can help me understand this." He pulled out a crumpled manual, pointing to technical terms he clearly didn't comprehend. And so they talked, not about the war or politics or the strange new world they inhabited, but about furnaces and ventilation systems and the particular challenge of repairing equipment designed in 1923. Crawford explained his work with patience, occasionally asking her to clarify a Japanese measurement or term. He never moved closer than necessary. He never let his gaze linger inappropriately. He treated her, Michiko realized, with a shock that made her hands tremble, like a person. When the furnace finally rumbled to life, Crawford packed his tools and bowed, a clumsy Western approximation that made her smile despite herself. "Thank you for your help, ma'am. You made this much easier." Michiko bowed in return, deeper, more formally. As she climbed the stairs back to her desk, she felt something she hadn't experienced in years, the faint, dangerous flutter of possibility. She was 43 years old, invisible to her own people living in a defeated nation occupied by foreigners. She had missed her season, wasted her youth, become the woman others pitied, but in a cold basement, a stranger had seen her. And that, she thought, was how everything would begin to change. The following weeks brought an unexpected rhythm to Michiko's life. Crawford returned twice more to adjust the heating system, and each time he requested her assistance with translations. Their conversations expanded beyond technical matters. He told her about Philadelphia, about working in his father's garage before the war, about the strangeness of being trusted to fix things in a country that had been the enemy months ago. Michiko found herself speaking more freely than she had in years. She told him about her work at the textile factory, about her father's love of poetry, about the particular silence that had filled her house after her mother died. She did not tell him about the aunts who had stopped inviting her to gatherings, or the neighbors who looked through her, as if she were already a ghost, or the crushing weight of being 43 and having lived, as one cousin had said, a life that went nowhere. Crawford listened with an attention that unnerved her. He asked questions. He remembered details from previous conversations. When she mentioned her father's poetry collection had been destroyed in the bombing, he looked genuinely saddened. "That's a loss," he said quietly. "History isn't just battles, it's poems too." The other clerks in the office noticed. Mrs. Shimizu, who processed refugee registrations at the next desk, began watching Michiko with narrowed eyes. During lunch break, she leaned close and whispered, "Be careful with the Americans. People talk." "We only discuss work," Michiko replied, her voice steady despite the anxiety tightening her chest. "That's not what it looks like." Mrs. Shimizu's tone carried warning, not kindness. "You're too old to be foolish about this. You think he sees you as anything other than easy prey? A woman your age, unmarried, desperate?" Michiko stood abruptly, her bento box clattering against the desk. She walked to the restroom and stood before the mirror, studying her reflection with brutal honesty. Grey threaded through her hair. Lines creased the corners of her eyes. Her face had the thinness of chronic hunger, the pallor of someone who had survived rather than lived. Mrs. Shimizu was right. What would a man like Crawford, young, vital, victorious, want with someone like her? That afternoon, when Crawford arrived to check the furnace pressure, Michiko remained at her desk. She sent the young receptionist, Yuki, instead. Yuki was 22, pretty, with the kind of hopeful energy that hadn't yet been crushed by war and disappointment. When they returned, Yuki was smiling, and Crawford looked confused, his eyes searching the office until they found Michiko. She looked away. He came to her desk before leaving. "Did I do something wrong?" "No," Michiko said, not meeting his gaze. "I have much work. Yuki-san will assist you from now on." Crawford was silent for a moment. Then he said very quietly in English, "I see, I understand." He left without another word. Michiko told herself she had made the right decision. safe, invisible. That was how she would survive this occupation, just as she had survived everything else. She threw herself into work, processing ration cards with mechanical precision, eating lunch alone at her desk, taking the long route home past the ruined department stores and makeshift markets where women traded family heirlooms for rice. But 2 weeks later, on a Saturday afternoon when Michiko was shopping for vegetables at the Ueno market, she saw him. Crawford stood near a fruit vendor, examining withered apples with a concentration that seemed excessive. When he noticed her, his face brightened with unmistakable relief. "Michiko-san," he said, forgetting formality. Then, catching himself, "I mean, Miss Tanaka, I've been hoping to see you." She should have bowed politely and walked away. Instead, she found herself rooted to the muddy ground, her basket of vegetables suddenly heavy. "Sergeant Crawford." "James," he corrected gently. "Could we talk, just for a moment?" Around them, the market bustled with desperate commerce and watchful eyes. Michiko felt the weight of potential judgment from every direction. Vendors who might remember her face, neighbors who might report seeing her with an American, the ever-present danger of being labeled a pan-pan girl, despite her age, despite her respectability, despite everything she had sacrificed to maintain her honor. But there was something in Crawford's expression, not pity, not desire, but something that looked almost like loneliness, that made her nod. "There is a tea house. 2 blocks from here, very quiet." The tea house occupied the ground floor of a building that had partially survived the bombing. Its owner, an elderly woman named Mrs. Hayashi, served watery green tea and sweet potato cakes that were more starch than sweetness. Few customers came anymore. It was a place for ghosts and people who wished to be invisible. Mrs. Hayashi's eyes widened when Michiko entered with Crawford, but she said nothing, simply gestured to a corner table far from the window. They sat across from each other, the low table between them like a border neither knew how to cross. "I thought I had offended you," Crawford began, his hands wrapped around the teacup as if trying to warm them. "No," Michiko said. "I was protecting myself." "From me?" "From gossip, from shame, from being seen with you." She met his eyes then, forcing herself to be honest in a way that felt both terrifying and liberating. "I am 43 years old, Sergeant Crawford. In my culture, I am considered a failure, a woman who missed her purpose. People already pity me. If they see me with you, they will think worse things." Crawford was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice carried a weight she hadn't heard before. "I'm 31. In my country, I'm considered less than human by many people. I can fix any engine ever made, but there are restaurants that won't serve me, hotels that won't give me a room, white soldiers who won't drink from the same canteen." He paused, then added, "I understand about shame you didn't earn." Something shifted in the space between them. Not romance, not yet, but recognition. 2 people who had spent their lives being judged for circumstances beyond their control, sitting in a tea house in a ruined city, choosing to see each other clearly. "Why did you want to talk to me?" Michiko asked. Crawford smiled, and it transformed his careful, guarded face into something open and vulnerable. "Because you're the first person in this city who speaks to me like I'm a person, not a uniform. Because you know things about poetry and history and how machines work. Because when you explain something, your whole face changes, like you forget to be invisible for a moment." He hesitated, then added, "Because I miss having a friend." Michiko felt tears threaten and forced them back. 43 years old, and a stranger was offering her friendship, something she hadn't realized had been missing from her life for so long. "I miss that too," she whispered. They talked until Mrs. Hayashi began closing the shutters, discussing everything and nothing. The difficulty of finding good paper for writing, the strange beauty of Tokyo's ruins in certain light, the small kindnesses that still existed amid destruction. When they finally left, Crawford walked her to her street corner, careful to maintain a respectful distance. "Could we do this again?" he asked. "Meet here, I mean, just to talk." Michiko knew what she was risking. The gossip, the judgment, the possibility that her parents, when they eventually returned from the countryside where they had fled during the worst bombing, would learn their spinster daughter had been seen with an American soldier, a black American soldier. But she also knew what 43 years of safety and invisibility had cost her, a life unlived, a heart that had forgotten how to feel anything but resignation. "Yes," she said, "Saturday afternoons, if you can." Crawford's smile was worth every risk she was taking. "I'll be there." As Michiko walked the final block to her small rented room, she realized she was smiling too. For the first time in years, she had something to look forward to. Something that was hers alone, not duty or obligation or the grinding weight of survival, but a small bright thing called possibility. The season she had missed, everyone had told her, was gone forever. But standing in the December cold, Michiko wondered if perhaps seasons could come more than once, if 43 wasn't an ending, but a different kind of beginning. Saturday afternoons became Michiko's secret rebellion. For 6 weeks, she and James met at Mrs. Hayashi's tea house, occupying the same corner table while the old woman pretended not to notice. Their conversations deepened like roots seeking water in drought-parched soil. James told her about growing up in a Philadelphia neighborhood where police looked at him with suspicion before he'd done anything wrong. About joining the army because it promised dignity, and discovering that prejudice wore a uniform too. Michiko spoke about her years caring for her dying mother while watching friends marry and build families, about the peculiar pain of being praised for sacrifice while being pitied for its consequences. "They called me dutiful," she said one grey afternoon, her tea growing cold between her hands. "But dutiful is just another word for wasted when you're a woman past 30. James leaned forward, his expression intense. "You weren't wasted. You loved someone enough to put her needs first. That's not nothing." "Tell that to my Aunt Keiko," Michiko replied with unexpected bitterness. "She said at my mother's funeral that at least Mother wouldn't have to watch me die alone and childless, as if that was the comfort we both needed." James reached across the table, stopping just short of touching her hand. "People can be cruel about things they don't understand." "And things they do understand," Michiko added quietly. "My sister understands perfectly well that I'm unmarried at 43. She just thinks it's my own fault for not trying hard enough, as if I could have conjured a husband from rice paste and desperation." The tea house became their sanctuary from a world that judged them harshly for different reasons. Mrs. Hayashi, who had lost her own husband and both sons in the war, seemed to understand the value of such spaces. She served their tea without commentary, occasionally adding an extra sweet potato cake to their plates when she thought they looked particularly worn down by the week. But sanctuaries, Michiko was learning, had permeable walls. It was late January when Mrs. Shimizu cornered her in the office supply room. "People are talking," she said without preamble, her voice sharp with something between concern and contempt. "About you and that colored soldier." Michiko's hands tightened on the stack of forms she'd been retrieving. "We are friends, we talk. Nothing improper happens." "You think that matters?" Mrs. Shimizu moved closer, blocking the doorway. "You think people care about what actually happens? A woman your age, unmarried, spending time with an American? They'll assume the worst because assuming the worst makes them feel better about their own compromises." "What compromises?" Michiko heard the dangerous edge in her own voice. "Mrs." Shimizu's face flushed. "We all do what we must to survive. I process their paperwork. Yuki smiles at their jokes. But we don't forget ourselves. We don't betray our dignity by actually befriending them." "Befriending them," Michiko repeated slowly. "Not stealing from them or lying to them, or accepting their cigarettes and chocolate while hating them behind their backs. Befriending them. That's the betrayal? You're being deliberately difficult." Mrs. Shimizu's voice rose slightly. "You know what I mean. A woman like you with no prospects, no future, you're vulnerable to manipulation. He probably sees you as easy because you're desperate. Get out of my way." Michiko's voice was ice. She pushed past Mrs. Shimizu, clutching the forms so tightly that her knuckles went white. The words followed her back to her desk, burrowing into the soft places where doubt already lived. "A woman like you. No prospects. Desperate." That night, Michiko stood before her bathroom mirror in the weak light of a single bulb. She studied her reflection with the same brutal honesty she'd applied 6 weeks earlier, but this time she tried to see what James might see, not the grey in her hair or the lines around her eyes, but the intelligence in her gaze, the strength in her posture, the face of someone who had survived impossible years without losing the capacity for kindness. Was she desperate? Perhaps. Was she vulnerable? Certainly. But was James manipulating her? Every conversation they'd shared, every careful maintenance of respectful distance, every time he'd listened to her speak about poetry or machinery or the particular way light fell through ruined buildings, was that all predatory calculation? She didn't believe it, but doubt, once planted, grew with persistent determination. The following Saturday, Michiko arrived at the tea house 15 minutes late, her heart hammering with anxiety she couldn't quite name. James was already there, 2 cups of tea cooling on the table, worry creasing his forehead. When he saw her, relief flooded his features. "I thought you might not come," he said simply. Michiko sat down slowly, her hands folded in her lap. "People at work are gossiping about us." James nodded, his expression darkening. "Same at my barracks. Some of the guys have been making comments. Nothing I can't handle, but..." He trailed off, then started again. "Do you want to stop meeting?" The question hung between them like smoke. Michiko realized this was the moment that would define everything, the choice between safety and possibility, between the life she'd resigned herself to and the terrifying uncertainty of something new. "What do you want?" she asked instead of answering. James was quiet for a long moment, his hands wrapped around his teacup. When he spoke, his voice carried a vulnerability that made Michiko's chest ache. "I want to keep knowing you. I want these Saturday afternoons. I want to hear your thoughts about things that matter and things that don't. I want..." He paused, meeting her eyes directly. "I want to stop pretending that you're just a friend, when you've become the person I think about when I'm fixing engines, when I'm trying to sleep, when I'm anywhere that isn't here." Michiko's breath caught. "James." "I know," he interrupted gently. "I know all the reasons this is complicated, the occupation, the differences between us, your family, my posting that could end any time, the fact that the world will judge us harshly for caring about each other." He leaned forward. "But I'm 31 years old, Michiko. I've spent my whole life being told I'm not good enough, not smart enough, not human enough to deserve basic dignity. And then I met you, and for the first time in longer than I can remember, I feel seen, actually seen." Tears blurred Michiko's vision. "I'm 43, she whispered. "I'm too old for romance, for dreams, for any of this." "Who told you that?" James asked quietly. "Who decided that 43 was too old to be happy?" "Everyone. Society. My family. People who pitied me for years before deciding I wasn't worth their pity anymore." The words spilled out like water from a cracked dam. "I'm the woman who missed her season, James. The daughter who wasted her youth on duty and ended up with nothing to show for it. I'm the cautionary tale, not the love story." James reached across the table then, actually touching her hand for the first time, his warm fingers wrapping around her cold ones. "You're the woman who sacrificed years to care for someone she loved, who survived a war that destroyed everything around her, who learned to speak English because she was curious about the world, who explains machine parts with the same passion other people reserve for art." His grip tightened. "You're not a cautionary tale, you're one of the bravest people I've ever met." Michiko looked down at their joined hands, her pale skin against his darker complexion, the visible evidence of everything that made their connection dangerous. She thought about Mrs. Shimizu's warnings, about the gossip already spreading, about her parents who would eventually return from the countryside and learn what their dutiful daughter had become. She thought about 43 years of being invisible, of swallowing disappointment like bitter medicine, of surviving when she'd stopped believing in living. "I'm frightened," she admitted. "Me too," James said. "But I'm more frightened of walking away from this and spending the rest of my life wondering what we might have been." Mrs. Hayashi appeared then, setting down fresh tea and 2 sweet potato cakes without a word. But as she turned away, she caught Michiko's eye and gave the smallest nod, not approval exactly, but acknowledgement, permission to choose her own path, however difficult. Michiko took a shaky breath. Saturday afternoons aren't enough anymore. James's expression shifted from hope to understanding to careful joy. No, he agreed, they're not. People will say terrible things about both of us. They already do. My parents will be ashamed. My mother would probably have strong opinions too. James smiled sadly, but she raised me to recognize kindness when I found it, to hold on to good things even when the world made it hard. Michiko turned her hand over, lacing her fingers properly through his. The gesture felt both natural and revolutionary, a quiet declaration in a tea house that smelled of weak green tea and survival. I don't know how to do this, she confessed. Romance, courtship, any of it. I'm 43 years old and I've never... Neither have I, James interrupted gently. Not really. Not like this, where it matters. He squeezed her hand. So we'll figure it out together. Slowly. Carefully. For as long as we have. For as long as we have. The words carried an implicit understanding. His military posting was temporary. The occupation wouldn't last forever, and their time together existed in a fragile bubble that reality would eventually puncture. But Michiko had spent 43 years living for a future that never arrived, sacrificing present joy for a security that proved illusory. Yes, she said simply. Let's figure it out together. When they left the tea house that evening, James walked her all the way to her door for the first time, no longer maintaining careful distance. At her threshold, he lifted her hand to his lips and kissed her knuckles, a gesture both old-fashioned and tender that made Michiko's heart stutter. Next Saturday, he asked, and perhaps Wednesday too, Michiko heard herself say, if you're free. His smile transformed his entire face. I'll make myself free. Michiko climbed the stairs to her small room, feeling something she hadn't experienced in decades, hope. Dangerous, irrational, completely impractical hope. She was 43 years old, entering forbidden territory with a man the world would condemn her for loving, risking everything she'd carefully preserved through years of war and disappointment. And for the first time in her life, she felt absolutely, terrifyingly alive. February arrived with bitter cold that seeped through Tokyo's ruined buildings like an accusation. Michiko and James began meeting twice weekly, Wednesdays for brief encounters during her lunch hour at a noodle shop near the occupation headquarters, Saturdays for longer afternoons at Mrs. Hayashi's tea house. They were careful, always maintaining public propriety, never touching where others might see. But the space between careful and reckless narrowed with each passing week. James brought her things, a blanket from the army surplus when he noticed her shivering, a book of American poetry he thought she'd appreciate, once a precious orange that he'd traded 2 packs of cigarettes to obtain. Michiko accepted these gifts with mixed gratitude and anxiety, knowing each one added weight to the gossip already spreading through her office like infection. Yuki, the young receptionist, had stopped speaking to her entirely. Mrs. Shimizu's disapproval had evolved into active hostility. She reported Michiko's extended lunch breaks to their supervisor, questioned her work quality in staff meetings, made pointed comments about women who forgot their dignity in pursuit of American favors. Michiko endured it with the same stoic patience she'd applied to everything else in her life, but James noticed the way tension lived in her shoulders now, how she startled at unexpected sounds. "You're suffering because of me," he said one Wednesday. Watching her pick at noodles, she was too anxious to eat properly. "I'm suffering because people are cruel," Michiko corrected. "That's not your fault." "But if we stopped..." "Don't," she looked up sharply. "Don't suggest that. Not unless you actually want to stop." James reached under the table, finding her hand and squeezing briefly before propriety forced him to let go. "I don't want to stop, but I don't want you hurt either." "I've been hurt by safety," Michiko said quietly, "by doing everything right and ending up invisible anyway. This, us, It's the first time in my life that pain actually means something, that it's a cost I chose instead of one that just happened to me. The words settled between them, heavy with truth. James nodded slowly, understanding in a way that only someone who'd also lived invisible could understand. But understanding didn't make survival easier. In mid-February, Michiko's landlady, Mrs. Endo, stopped her on the stairs. "I've heard disturbing rumors," she began without preamble, her weathered face stern. "About you and an American soldier." Michiko's stomach dropped, but she kept her voice steady. "I have an acquaintance who is American, yes." "An acquaintance?" Mrs. Endo's tone dripped skepticism. "People say he walks you home, that you meet him regularly. A colored soldier, they say, which makes it even more scandalous." "His character matters more than his color," Michiko replied, hearing the dangerous edge in her own voice. Mrs. Endo's expression hardened. "Your parents left you in my care when they fled to the countryside. They trusted me to ensure their daughter maintained respectability. I cannot have a tenant who brings shame to my building. People notice, people talk. It affects my other renters. I have done nothing shameful. You exist in proximity to shame, which amounts to the same thing." Mrs. Endo crossed her arms. "End this association, or I will be forced to ask you to find other accommodations. I'll give you 2 weeks to decide." Michiko climbed to her room with legs that felt like water. 2 weeks. She had 2 weeks to choose between James and the modest security of a roof over her head. The practical choice was obvious. End the relationship, return to invisibility, survive as she'd always survived. James would understand. He'd probably even agree it was the wise decision. But when Saturday came and she saw him waiting at their corner table, the careful hope in his expression as he spotted her, the way his entire face transformed when she smiled, the practical choice felt like slow death. "My landlady gave me an ultimatum," she told him after they'd settled with their tea. "Stop seeing you or find a new place to live." James's jaw tightened. "Michiko, I'm looking for new lodging," she continued before he could argue. "Mrs. Hayashi mentioned she has a room available above the tea house. It's smaller than what I have now, more expensive, but she doesn't seem to judge." "You'd uproot your life because of me." "I'd uproot my life because of me," Michiko corrected firmly, "because I'm 43 years old and I'm tired of other people deciding what I'm allowed to want." James was quiet for a long moment, emotion working across his face. "There's something I need to tell you," he finally said. "My unit received orders. We're being reassigned to Osaka in April." The words hit like physical impact. April, 6 weeks away. Michiko had known this was coming eventually. Occupation forces rotated regularly. Postings shifted according to military needs she didn't understand, but knowing intellectually and confronting the actual timeline were devastatingly different. "Osaka," she repeated numbly. "It's not far." "Maybe I could get weekend passes, find ways to come back." James was speaking quickly now, trying to solve an unsolvable problem. "Or maybe you could visit. I don't know how, but there has to be a way." "James," Michiko placed her hand over his, propriety forgotten. "We both knew this was temporary. Knowing doesn't make it easier." "No," she agreed. "It doesn't." They sat in heavy silence, the tea cooling between them, while Mrs. Hayashi diplomatically busied herself in the kitchen. Finally, James spoke again, his voice rough with emotion. "I need to tell you something else, something I've been afraid to say, because saying it makes losing you worse." Michiko's heart hammered against her ribs. "Tell me." "I love you." The words came out simple, direct, devastating. "I love your mind and your courage, and the way you explain things like the world still deserves your patience. I love that you're 43 and brave enough to risk everything for something as foolish as happiness. I love you, and I know I shouldn't. And I know it makes everything harder. But I can't keep pretending I don't." Tears spilled down Michiko's cheeks. The first she'd allowed herself since this entire impossible situation began. "I love you too," she whispered. "I didn't think I was capable of it anymore. But I love you, completely. Uselessly, Not uselessly, James said fiercely. Never uselessly. Then what do we do? You leave in 6 weeks. I'm moving out of my lodging because of you. My parents will return from the countryside eventually and discover their spinster daughter fell in love with an American soldier during the occupation. There's no future here, James, just borrowed time. Then we make the most of borrowed time. James wiped tears from her cheek with his thumb, gentle and deliberate. We have 6 weeks. Let's not waste them preparing for goodbye. Michiko knew this was irrational. She knew she was diving deeper into water that would eventually close over her head. She knew that every additional day with James would make his departure more devastating. The practical choice was to end things now, salvage what remained of her dignity, return to the safe invisibility she'd mastered. But she'd spent 43 years making practical choices, and they'd left her alone in a cold room, pitied by relatives, dismissed by society, unlived in every way that mattered. 6 weeks, she agreed, her voice steady despite the tears. Let's not waste a single moment. James smiled then, sad and grateful and full of love he hadn't asked for, but couldn't deny. They stayed at the tea house until Mrs. Hayashi gently informed them she was closing, then walked through Tokyo's ruined streets holding hands openly for the first time, past the watching eyes and whispered judgments, claiming this small defiant joy even as the countdown to separation had already begun. Michiko moved into the room above Mrs. Hayashi's tea house on the 1st of March. It was smaller than her previous lodging, barely large enough for a futon, a small table, and the wooden trunk that held everything she owned. But the window faced east, catching morning light, and Mrs. Hayashi asked no questions about the American sergeant who helped carry boxes up the narrow stairs. "My sons would have been your age," the old woman said, as James departed, watching him from the window with an expression Michiko couldn't quite read. "They died at Okinawa, both of them, 3 weeks apart. I hated Americans for a long time. Hated everyone who survived when my boys didn't." Michiko waited, understanding this wasn't a condemnation, but something else. "Then I realized hate was just another kind of dying," Mrs. Hayashi continued quietly. "The war took my sons. I wouldn't let it take my capacity for recognizing decent men when I saw them." She turned to face Michiko directly. "That soldier looks at you like you're precious. In all the destruction we've survived, precious things should be protected, not condemned." The words settled in Michiko's chest like a blessing she hadn't known she needed. With her housing secured and James's departure looming, they made a silent agreement to stop hiding. Not flagrantly, that would have been dangerous for them both, but with quiet dignity that refused shame. James walked her home from work twice a week. They ate at small restaurants where owners had decided survival meant serving anyone with money regardless of uniform color. On Sundays they took long walks through Tokyo's ruins, finding unexpected beauty in the way plants pushed through rubble, how children still played in bombed-out lots, the stubborn insistence of life continuing despite everything. People stared, some muttered. Once, a group of young men followed them for several blocks, making crude comments until James turned around with a look that suggested his patience had limits. They scattered quickly, their bravado evaporating in the face of actual confrontation, but there were also small kindnesses. A fruit vendor who sold them persimmons without the markup he charged other Americans. A mother who smiled at them in a park, then told her curious children that love took many forms. An elderly man who bowed to James after learning he was an engineer, saying the world needed builders more than it needed warriors. At work, the hostility intensified. Mrs. Shimizu's contempt had evolved into active sabotage. She accidentally misfiled Michiko's paperwork, excluded her from office communications, made sure their supervisor heard every rumor about the shameless spinster and her colored soldier. Yuki still wouldn't speak to her, and 2 other clerks had started eating lunch elsewhere to avoid association. Michiko endured it with a serenity that surprised her. The contempt hurt less than it would have months ago, insulated somehow by the knowledge that she was choosing this pain rather than having it inflicted by circumstances beyond her control. She was living, finally, instead of merely surviving, and living meant accepting consequences. 3 weeks before James's departure, he brought her to the base library during an authorized civilian visit day. It was a small room filled with English books, magazines, and newspapers, more reading material than Michiko had seen in one place since before the war. James watched her face as she examined the shelves, her fingers trailing over spines with reverent care. "Take some," he urged. "As many as you want. I couldn't—" "You can. I already cleared it with the librarian. Said you were helping me learn Japanese and needed English reference materials." His smile was conspiratorial. Which is technically true. Michiko selected 5 books, 2 novels, a poetry collection, a technical manual about mechanical engineering that made James laugh, and a thick English dictionary. She held them like treasure as they walked back toward her lodging, already anticipating the hours she'd spend reading after he left, these books becoming tangible connections to him across distance. "Michiko," James said as they neared the tea house. "There's something I want to ask you, but I'm afraid it's selfish." She stopped walking, studying his face. "Ask." He took a deep breath, nervous in a way she rarely saw. "I want to be with you, really with you, before I leave." He rushed on before she could respond. "I know it's asking everything, that there are cultural complications, that we haven't, but I need you to know that I love you completely, and I want to show you that love in every way possible." "But only if you want that too." Michiko's heart hammered against her ribs. She was 43 years old, a virgin by circumstance rather than choice, about to lose the only man who'd ever loved her to military reassignment. Society had already condemned her. Her reputation was thoroughly destroyed. She'd sacrificed housing, workplace peace, and family approval for this relationship. What did she have left to protect? "Yes," she said simply. "Yes, I want that." James's expression shifted through surprise to joy, to something deeper that made Michiko's breath catch. "When?" "Saturday. Come to my room in the evening. Mrs. Hayashi is visiting her sister overnight. We'll have privacy." The 5 days until Saturday passed with agonizing slowness and terrifying speed simultaneously. Michiko cleaned her small room obsessively, changed the futon sheets, bought incense to mask the persistent smell of damp wood. She felt foolish preparing like a bride when she was 43, and this man was leaving in 2 weeks regardless. But foolishness seemed appropriate for the situation. This entire relationship had been one beautiful, irrational act of defiance against a life that had taught her to expect nothing. On Friday evening, Mrs. Hayashi stopped her on the stairs. "I'm leaving tomorrow at noon for my sister's. I'll return Sunday evening." She paused, then added gently, "The walls here are thick. No one will hear anything. No one will know anything, you understand?" Michiko felt heat flood her face, but she met the old woman's eyes. "Thank you." Mrs. Hayashi nodded. "We get so few chances for happiness. When they come, we should grab them with both hands." Saturday arrived grey and cold, the kind of March day that promised spring but delivered winter. Michiko worked through her morning shift in a haze of anticipation and anxiety, barely hearing Mrs. Shimizu's latest barb about women with loose morals. At noon she rushed home, bathed carefully in the cold water, put on her best remaining kimono, dark blue silk that had survived the war years, wrapped carefully in paper. James arrived precisely at 7 as promised. He wore civilian clothes rather than his uniform, carrying flowers he must have searched half of Tokyo to find. He looked nervous, almost boyish, this man who fixed complex machinery and had survived a war looking uncertain on her threshold. "Come in," Michiko said, stepping aside. He entered slowly, taking in the small room that held everything she owned. "It's nice, very you." They sat at her low table, drinking tea neither tasted, conversation stilted in a way it hadn't been in weeks. Finally, Michiko laughed, a nervous, slightly hysterical sound. "We're both terrified." "Absolutely terrified," James agreed, laughing too. The admission broke something open between them. He reached across the table, taking both her hands in his. "We don't have to do anything. Just being here with you is enough." "It's not enough for me," Michiko said quietly. "I've spent 43 years accepting enough. Tonight, I want everything." James's breath hitched. He stood, pulling her gently to her feet, and kissed her with a tenderness that made tears prick her eyes. "Then everything is what I'll give you," he murmured against her lips. What followed was awkward and tender, and nothing like the romantic stories Michiko had occasionally read. There was fumbling with unfamiliar clothing, nervous laughter when her kimono obi proved more complicated than James anticipated, moments of uncertainty where they had to communicate wants and boundaries neither had ever spoken aloud before. It hurt at first, then didn't, then transformed into something that felt like coming home to a place she'd never known existed. Afterward, they lay tangled in her futon, James's dark skin striking against her paleness in the dim lantern light. Michiko traced patterns on his chest, memorizing the solid warmth of him. "I love you," she whispered. "I need you to remember that. After you leave, after everything ends, remember that I loved you completely." James caught her hand, pressing it flat against his heart. "This isn't ending. I'm being reassigned, not disappearing. We'll find ways to see each other. We'll write letters. And when my service ends—" "Don't," Michiko interrupted gently. "Don't make promises about a future we can't control. This moment is enough." But even as she said it, she knew it was a lie. This moment would never be enough. She would spend the rest of her life wanting more of him, more conversations, more walks through ruined cities, more nights like this, where the world narrowed to just their two bodies and the fierce, improbable love between them. They had 10 days left. Michiko intended to make every single one count. The final 10 days passed like water through desperate fingers. Michiko and James abandoned all pretense of casual friendship, spending every possible moment together. They walked through Ueno Park holding hands openly, ate at small restaurants without caring who noticed, kissed goodbye at street corners while pedestrians stared. The gossip reached fever pitch. Mrs. Shimizu informed the entire office that Michiko had completely disgraced herself, and rumors spread that she was pregnant, diseased, or being paid for her affections. Michiko discovered that rock bottom had an unexpected freedom. When you'd already lost your reputation, your housing security, and your family's approval, there was nothing left to protect except the love itself. James tried to plan for their future. "I'll write every week," he promised during one of their last evenings together. "And I'll request leave to visit Tokyo. Maybe you could take the train to Osaka sometimes. We'll make this work." Michiko wanted to believe him, but she'd lived long enough to recognize the difference between hope and likelihood. Military reassignments became permanent postings. Distance eroded even strong connections. He would meet someone younger, easier, without the complicated weight of occupation politics and cultural barriers. She would return to her small room and her hostile workplace and the life she'd briefly escaped. But she didn't say this. Instead, she kissed him and said, "We'll try." On James's last Saturday in Tokyo, they returned to Mrs. Hayashi's tea house, the place where everything had begun. The old woman served them with extra care, bringing out hoarded sugar for their tea and rice cakes. She must have traded precious rations to obtain. She understood, in the way only someone who'd lost deeply could understand, that last moments deserved ceremony. "My parents are returning next week," Michiko told James, as they sat at their corner table. "The letter came yesterday. They've found temporary housing in the city and want to see me immediately." James's expression darkened. "Will you tell them about us?" "I'll have to. The neighbors will inform them if I don't." Michiko kept her voice steady, despite the anxiety coiling in her stomach. "They'll be ashamed, angry. My father may disown me entirely." "Then come with me." The words burst from James urgently. "To Osaka. We'll find you work, a place to live. You wouldn't have to face them alone." Michiko wanted this so badly it physically hurt. To run away with him, start fresh somewhere her past hadn't already condemned her, but she'd spent 43 years learning that running from consequences only delayed them. "I can't abandon my parents after they've lost everything. They're old, James. They need me, even if they'll hate what I've become." "What you've become is someone brave enough to choose her own happiness. To them, I've become a disgrace who betrayed her culture for an occupying soldier." Michiko blinked back tears. Both things can be true. They spent that final evening in Michiko's small room, making love with desperate tenderness, as if physical connection could somehow transcend the separation they both knew was coming. Afterward, James held her so tightly she could barely breathe, his face buried in her hair. "I won't forget you," he whispered fiercely. "However long it takes, whatever happens, I won't forget." Michiko pressed her face against his chest, memorizing the steady rhythm of his heartbeat. "Neither will I." Sunday morning arrived cold and grey. James had to report to base by noon for the convoy to Osaka. They walked to the meeting point together, past the ruins and rebuilding, past the stairs and whispers, past everything that had tried to keep them apart. At the designated corner, other soldiers were already gathering, loading trucks with equipment and personal belongings. Several glanced at James and Michiko with expressions ranging from curiosity to disapproval. James ignored them all, turning to face her completely. "This isn't goodbye," he said firmly. "This is just until later." "Until later," Michiko repeated, though the words felt hollow. James pulled an envelope from his jacket. "My address in Osaka. Write to me, please, even if it's just to tell me you're safe." Michiko took the envelope with shaking hands. She'd prepared her own letter, 3 pages of everything she couldn't say aloud, sealed and ready. She pressed it into his palm. "Read it on the train, not before." They stood facing each other as the truck started loading, as sergeants called orders, as the machinery of military logistics ground forward without care for 2 people trying to stretch a moment beyond its natural limits. Finally, James cupped her face in both hands and kissed her, long, deep, publicly, a declaration and a promise, and a goodbye all at once. "I love you, Michiko Tanaka," he said against her lips. 43 or 93, you're the best thing that ever happened to me. I love you, James Crawford." Michiko let tears fall freely now. "You taught me that it's never too late to start living." A final whistle blew. James backed toward the truck, their hands separating last, fingers trailing apart reluctantly. He climbed into the vehicle, finding a seat near the window so he could keep watching her. Michiko stood on the corner as engines roared to life, as the convoy began rolling forward, as the distance between them expanded from feet to yards to blocks. She stood there long after the trucks disappeared, holding the envelope with his address, feeling the ghost of his touch still warm on her skin. Around her, Tokyo continued its relentless process of rebuilding, construction crews hammering at damaged buildings, merchants hawking goods, children playing in the streets. Life insisted on moving forward whether you were ready or not. Michiko walked back to her room slowly, noticing for the first time how spring was attempting to arrive. Green shoots pushed through rubble, cherry trees showed the first hint of buds that would bloom in a few weeks. The world was renewing itself with stubborn determination, indifferent to individual heartbreak. In her room, she carefully placed James's address in her wooden trunk beside the books he'd given her, the blanket he'd brought when she was cold, the pressed flower from their walk in Ueno Park. Evidence that it had been real, that she hadn't imagined this brief, impossible love. Then she sat at her small table and began writing the first of what would become many letters, pouring onto paper everything she felt and feared and hoped. She didn't know if distance would destroy what they'd built. She didn't know if his promises would survive military life and the inevitable pressure to find someone easier, more appropriate, less complicated. But she knew this. She was 43 years old, no longer invisible, no longer living only for duty and survival. James had given her that, not salvation but the courage to claim her own life with both hands, whatever the cost. Her parents would arrive next week. There would be recriminations, shame, possibly outright rejection. Mrs. Shimizu and the office gossips would continue their campaign of contempt. The world would keep judging her harshly for loving someone it had decided she shouldn't. But none of that could erase the fact that for 4 months Michiko had been fully, completely alive. She had loved and been loved. She had chosen risk over safety, passion over propriety, living over merely surviving. Whatever came next, she would face it as someone who finally understood her own worth, not as the daughter who missed her season, but as a woman brave enough to create her own. Outside her window, Tokyo rebuilt itself one brick at a time. Inside her small room, Michiko did the same. One word at a time, one breath at a time, one act of courage at a time. The season she'd been told was lost forever had arrived after all, just not in the form anyone expected. Michiko's parents arrived on a Tuesday afternoon, their faces carrying the particular exhaustion of people who'd survived war only to discover survival itself was another kind of battle. Her father looked older than his 62 years, his shoulders bent from months doing manual labor in rural fields. Her mother's elegant hands, once soft from a middle-class life, were now rough and scarred from farm work. They stood in the entrance of Mrs. Hayashi's tea house, staring at their daughter with confusion that would soon harden into something worse. "You're living above a tea house now?" her father asked, his voice tight with the effort of remaining civil. "What happened to Mrs. Endo's boarding house?" "I chose to leave," Michiko said carefully. "This arrangement suits me better." Her mother's eyes narrowed with the particular suspicion mothers develop after raising daughters for 4 decades. "Chose to leave? Or were asked to leave?" They climbed the narrow stairs to her room, her parents' silence growing heavier with each step. Once inside, they stood examining the small space with expressions that communicated more than words. This was a descent from their expectations, evidence of failure they'd somehow missed while struggling for survival in the countryside. "Sit, please," Michiko offered, gesturing to the cushions around her low table. "I'll make tea." "We didn't come for tea," her father said sharply. "We came because Mrs. Endo sent a letter to our country address, a letter detailing extremely disturbing rumors about our daughter and an American soldier." Michiko's hands stilled on the teapot. She'd known this confrontation was inevitable, had rehearsed various approaches during sleepless nights, but actual confrontation hit differently than imagination. "The rumors are true," she said quietly. "I've been seeing an American sergeant. His name is James Crawford. He's been reassigned to Osaka, but we correspond." Her mother made a small wounded sound. Her father's face went rigid with the kind of fury that came from shame, compounded by powerlessness. "Seeing him," he repeated, his voice dangerously quiet. "What does seeing him mean exactly?" "It means I loved him. Love him still." Michiko forced herself to meet her father's eyes. "It means we spent time together, that we cared for each other, that he treated me with respect and kindness during a time when both were scarce. He's an occupier," her father spat, "part of the force that destroyed our country, killed our people, humiliated our nation, and you betrayed everything we are by consorting with him." "He's an engineer who fixes broken heating systems," Michiko countered, feeling anger rise to match her father's. "He didn't bomb our cities or kill our soldiers. He came after the surrender, trying to help rebuild what was destroyed. He's American. That's enough." Her father stood abruptly, his small frame vibrating with rage. "And Mrs. Endo mentioned he was colored. You've disgraced yourself with a Negro soldier? Do you understand what that makes you? What people will say?" "I understand perfectly," Michiko said, her voice hardening. "People will say I'm a pan girl, a race traitor, a desperate spinster who threw away her dignity for American attention. They've been saying it for months. I've lost my housing, my workplace reputation, and apparently my family's respect. I understand the cost." Her mother finally spoke, tears streaming down her weathered face. "Then why? Why would you do this to yourself? To us?" The question broke something open in Michiko's chest. "Because I'm 43 years old, and I'd never been loved. Because I spent my 20s caring for you during your illness, Mother, watching marriage opportunities disappear while relatives pitied me. Because I spent my 30s being called a failure, a waste, the daughter who missed her purpose. Because the war came and I survived it feeling nothing but grateful to still be breathing." She paused, struggling for composure. "And then James saw me. Actually saw me. Not as a failure, or a burden, or a lost cause, but as someone worth knowing, worth loving." "Love," her father sneered. "You think an American soldier loves you? You think you're special to him? He used you, Michiko. He saw a lonely, desperate woman, and he took advantage. That's not love. That's exploitation. He asked nothing of me I didn't freely give, Michiko said firmly. He respected my boundaries. He learned about my culture. He listened when I spoke about things that mattered. He brought me books because he knew I loved reading. He held my hand when I cried about being invisible for so many years. Her voice cracked. That's not exploitation. That's love. Her mother wiped her eyes roughly. Love doesn't matter if it destroys your reputation. You'll never find a Japanese husband now. You'll spend the rest of your life marked by this shame. Was it worth it? Michiko thought about James's hands, gentle on her face, the way he'd looked at her like she mattered. The nights in her small room where 43 years of loneliness had finally been answered, the feeling of being fully alive instead of merely existing. Yes, she said simply, it was worth it. Her father's expression shifted from rage to something colder, disappointment that had calcified into rejection. Then you're no daughter of mine. We survived the war, lost everything, suffered in ways you can't imagine, all while maintaining our dignity and honor. And you threw both away for a foreigner who'll forget you the moment someone younger and easier comes along. The words landed like physical blows, but Michiko refused to flinch. I'm sorry you feel that way, Father, but I'm not sorry for loving James. I'm not sorry for choosing myself for once instead of duty and other people's expectations. Choosing yourself, her mother echoed bitterly. What a modern, selfish idea. We raised you better than this. You raised me to sacrifice everything for others and accept nothing for myself, Michiko corrected quietly. You taught me that my purpose was service and my value was obedience. And I lived that way for 43 years until I had nothing left to show for it except loneliness and regret. Her father moved toward the door, his movement stiff with fury, barely contained. When this American abandons you, and he will, don't come to us expecting sympathy. You've made your choice. Live with it. Her mother lingered a moment longer, her expression complex with warring emotions. I don't understand you, she whispered. I don't understand how you could do this. I know, Michiko said gently, but maybe someday you'll understand why I had to. They left, their footsteps heavy on the stairs, the door closing with terrible finality. Michiko stood in her small room, trembling with adrenaline and grief, feeling the weight of what she'd just lost. Not just her parents' approval, but the possibility of reconciliation, the safety net of family, the last threads connecting her to the life she'd known before James. She'd gambled everything on a love that might not survive distance and time. She'd chosen passion over security, living over mere survival, and the cost was proving exactly as devastating as everyone had warned. But even through the pain, even with her parents' rejection still echoing in her ears, Michiko couldn't regret it. For the first time in her life, she'd made a choice that was entirely hers. She'd claimed agency in a world that had spent 43 years denying her any. That night, she wrote James a letter describing everything that had happened. She didn't soften the details or hide her pain. She wrote honestly about the confrontation, the rejection, the fear that maybe her father was right and James would eventually forget her. Then she sealed the letter, addressed it carefully to Osaka, and carried it to the post office before she could reconsider. Whatever happened next, she would face it as someone who'd finally learned to choose herself, even when the world punished her for it. Mrs. Hayashi found her on the stairs afterward, clearly having heard the confrontation through her supposedly thick walls. She didn't offer platitudes or false comfort. Instead, she handed Michiko a cup of real tea, not the weak substitute they'd been drinking for years, but actual expensive tea she must have been hoarding since before the war. For courage, the old woman said simply. You'll need it for what comes next. Michiko accepted the cup, the warmth seeping into her cold hands. She'd lost her family, but perhaps in this tea house run by a woman who understood that survival sometimes meant defying expectations, she'd found something else. Not replacement family, but chosen family. The kind you built from understanding and mutual respect, rather than obligation and blood. It wasn't what she'd imagined when she first fell in love with James Crawford. But then again, nothing about this journey had matched her expectations. And somehow, that made it all the more precious. Spring arrived with determined cherry blossoms that turned Tokyo's ruins momentarily beautiful. Michiko walked to work through petals, falling like pink snow, carrying James's latest letter in her pocket like a talisman. They'd been writing twice weekly for 6 weeks. His letters arriving with reassuring regularity, hers departing with the same faithfulness. He wrote about Osaka, about the engineering projects he'd been assigned, about missing her with an intensity that made her heart ache. She wrote about work, about Mrs. Hayashi's kindness, about the strange liberation of having nothing left to lose, but she didn't tell him about the escalating harassment at her office. Mrs. Shimizu's campaign had evolved from gossip to active sabotage. Important documents disappeared from Michiko's desk. Her work was criticized publicly during meetings for errors she hadn't made. Colleagues excluded her from group lunches, spoke about her in loud whispers designed to be overheard. The supervisor, a middle-aged man who'd been polite before the scandal, now treated her with barely concealed contempt. "Miss Tanaka," he called her into his office on a Wednesday morning. "Your performance has been declining. Multiple complaints about your work quality. I'm afraid we need to discuss your future with this department." Michiko sat across from him, back straight, despite the exhaustion weighing on her shoulders. "My work quality hasn't changed. The complaints are coming from colleagues who disapprove of my personal life. Your personal life affects workplace morale," he replied coldly. "Several employees have expressed discomfort working alongside someone who fraternizes with occupation forces. I'm friends with an American who treated me with kindness and respect. That's my crime? Your crime is lacking judgment about appropriate associations." He shuffled papers on his desk, not meeting her eyes. "I'm giving you formal notice. 2 weeks to find alternative employment. After that, your position will be terminated." Michiko had expected this, had prepared for it even, but the reality still hit hard. "I understand," she said quietly, refusing to give him the satisfaction of seeing her break. She returned to her desk, gathered her few personal items and left early. No one acknowledged her departure. She walked home through cherry blossom petals, feeling the ground shift beneath her feet. No job meant no income. No income meant she couldn't afford even Mrs. Hayashi's modest rent. The careful stability she'd constructed was collapsing. That evening, Mrs. Hayashi knocked on her door. "I heard you lost your position." Michiko looked up from the letter she'd been composing to James. News travels fast. In this city, shame travels faster than joy. Mrs. Hayashi entered, sitting down uninvited. "I have a proposal. I need help running the tea house. My arthritis makes the work difficult. I can't pay much, but it would cover your rent and meals. You'd be working for me, not with me. There's a difference in dignity." Michiko felt tears prick her eyes. "You'd hire me. Despite the gossip, it could hurt your business." "My business is already dying," Mrs. Hayashi said bluntly. "This whole city is dying and being reborn as something else. Maybe I should be reborn too. Maybe that means employing a woman brave enough to love who she chooses despite the consequences." "I don't know how to run a tea house." "I'll teach you, unless you'd prefer unemployment." Michiko laughed, a wet, grateful sound. "When do I start?" "Tomorrow morning. Wear something practical. Making tea for judgmental customers requires thick skin and comfortable clothing. Working at the tea house proved simultaneously easier and harder than office work. The physical labor was demanding, serving tea, preparing simple food, cleaning constantly. But there were no misses. Shimizu's here, no whispered campaigns designed to destroy her. Just customers who either accepted service from the scandalous woman or took their business elsewhere. Enough accepted that the tea house survived, though barely. James's letters continued with faithful regularity. He wrote about trying to visit Tokyo on leave, but being denied. His commanding officer had heard about his inappropriate association and blocked the request. He wrote about the loneliness of Osaka, about fixing engines while thinking of her, about missing Saturday afternoons when they could talk for hours about everything and nothing. Michiko wrote back honestly now, no longer hiding her struggles. She told him about losing her job, about working at the tea house, about her parents' continued silence. She told him she missed him with an intensity that frightened her, that some mornings she woke reaching for someone who wasn't there. In July, his letters changed tone. He'd applied for early discharge from the army. His required service period was ending, and he wanted to return to civilian life. To Philadelphia, where his family was, where he could work in his father's expanded garage. The subtext was clear. He was leaving Japan, possibly forever. Michiko read that letter sitting in her small room while summer rain drummed against the window. She'd known this was coming. Of course he would return home eventually. But knowing intellectually and confronting the reality felt different. She tried to imagine life after James finally, completely left. It looked like her room, like the tea house, like endless days bleeding into each other, without the bright spots his letters provided. She wrote back carefully, "I'm happy you'll be home with your family. You've earned that peace. Please don't worry about me. I'm managing." His response came faster than usual, the handwriting more urgent. "Managing isn't living. You taught me that. My discharge is approved for October. I'll have 2 weeks in Tokyo before shipping out. We need to talk, really talk, about the future." Michiko's hands shook, holding that letter. 2 weeks. One last gift of borrowed time before the final goodbye. She should be grateful. Instead, she felt the approaching loss like a physical weight. September arrived with cooling temperatures and the particular melancholy of seasons changing. Michiko worked at the tea house, wrote letters to James, and tried not to calculate how many days remained before October. Mrs. Hayashi watched her with knowing eyes, but said nothing, just ensured Michiko ate properly and occasionally pressed small amounts of extra money into her hands. "For practical things," she'd say cryptically, "you'll need your strength." One afternoon, a woman Michiko didn't recognize entered the tea house, well-dressed, around 40, with an air of confident authority. She ordered tea, then asked directly, "Are you Michiko Tanaka?" Michiko's stomach tightened. "Yes." "I'm Kenji Sato's sister. He works at the government office where you used to be employed." She paused, studying Michiko carefully. "He told me what happened, how you were treated. I wanted to meet the woman who chose love over safety." Michiko didn't know how to respond. "I'm not sure I chose anything. It just happened." "Choosing not to hide is choosing," the woman replied. "Choosing not to be ashamed is choosing. My brother says you lost everything for an American soldier. He thinks you're foolish. I think you're extraordinary." She left before Michiko could process the conversation, paying double for her tea with a bow of respect that felt like absolution Michiko hadn't known she needed. Small moments like that sustained her. Unexpected kindness from strangers, Mrs. Hayashi's steady support, James's letters that arrived like clockwork. She was surviving, but more than that, she was living. Differently than she'd planned, with more pain and uncertainty than she'd wanted, but authentically in a way her first 43 years had never been. October approached like a storm on the horizon. Inevitable, potentially devastating, but also strangely clarifying. James would come. They would have 2 weeks. Then he would leave, and Michiko would face whatever came next with the strength she'd developed through choosing herself, despite the cost. She was ready. As ready as anyone could be for losing the person who'd taught her she deserved to be loved. James arrived on the first Thursday of October, appearing at the tea house door in civilian clothes that made him look simultaneously more familiar and more foreign. He carried a single duffel bag and an expression that mixed joy at seeing Michiko with something heavier, determination shadowed by uncertainty. Mrs. Hayashi took one look at them and announced she was closing early. "Take your time," she told Michiko, pressing the keys into her hand. "Lock up when you're finished. I'll be upstairs if you need anything." They stood facing each other across the empty tea house, months of letters and longing condensed into this single moment. Then James crossed the space between them and pulled Michiko into his arms, holding her so tightly she felt bones compress. She buried her face against his chest, breathing him in, familiar and desperately missed. "I thought 2 weeks would feel like enough time," he murmured into her hair, but now that I'm here I know it won't be. They spent that evening simply existing together. No grand conversations, just the quiet pleasure of proximity after months apart. Michiko made tea properly, the way Mrs. Hayashi had taught her. James told her about the train ride from Osaka, about watching the countryside transform back into Tokyo's organized chaos. They didn't discuss the future, both instinctively avoiding the weight of decisions that needed making. But the next morning, James brought up what they'd been dancing around. They were walking through Ueno Park, watching early autumn paint the trees gold and red, when he stopped abruptly and turned to face her. "Come with me," he said without preamble. "To America, to Philadelphia. Marry me and come home with me." Michiko's breath caught. She'd imagined he might ask, had rehearsed various responses during sleepless nights, but the actual proposal hit with unexpected force. "James, I know all the reasons it's complicated," he continued quickly. "Immigration laws make it difficult for Japanese nationals. My family might struggle accepting you initially. Philadelphia isn't Tokyo, and you'd be giving up everything familiar. But Michiko, I love you. I want to build a life with you, a real life, not one stolen between letters and brief visits." "What kind of life could we have?" Michiko asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'd be a Japanese war bride married to a black man in America. You've told me about segregation, about the prejudice you face. I just add another layer of difficulty to your life. Or you'd add love and partnership and someone who sees me clearly," James countered. "Yes, it would be hard. Yes, we'd face challenges, but we're already facing those things. At least in Philadelphia we'd face them together." Michiko turned away, looking at the pond where ducks floated peacefully, oblivious to human complications. "My parents disowned me for loving you. My employer fired me. I lost my housing, my reputation, everything I'd carefully preserved. And you're asking me to lose my country too?" "I'm asking you to gain a future," James said gently. "What do you have here? A job serving tea to people who judge you. A family that won't speak to you. A society that's marked you as shameful. Is that really a life worth protecting?" The words hurt because they were true. Michiko had nothing left in Tokyo except Mrs. Hayashi's kindness and the hollow dignity of surviving despite judgment. But leaving felt like final defeat, abandoning Japan after it had already abandoned her, proving everyone right who'd said she'd betrayed her culture for an American. "I need time to think," she said finally. "You have 2 weeks, then I ship out, and the decision gets made for us." They spent the following days in careful exploration of what their potential future might hold. James took her to the American consulate, where officials explained the complex process for Japanese nationals seeking to immigrate as military spouses. The racism was barely coded. Questions about her morality, her motivations, whether she understood the challenges of interracial marriage in America. The bureaucrat reviewing their case looked at Michiko with undisguised contempt, as if she were merchandise of questionable quality, trying to gain improper access to American shores. Michiko left the consulate feeling soiled and angry. "They treated me like a prostitute looking for citizenship, not a woman considering marriage." "I know," James said quietly. "I'm sorry. But that's the process. We'd have to endure it together." They visited a photographer to take formal portraits required for the marriage application. The photographer, an older Japanese man, refused service once he understood the situation. "I don't facilitate such unions," he said coldly. They found another photographer eventually, a younger man who'd lost his judgmental capacity, along with his left arm during the war. "Love is love," he said simply, positioning them carefully. "Smile like you mean it. These photos need to convince bureaucrats you're genuine." The photos captured them in formal dress, James in his army uniform one last time, Michiko in her best remaining kimono. They looked serious, almost somber, but if you studied closely you could see their hands clasped tightly together just out of frame, holding on like drowning people. A week into James's visit, Michiko's mother appeared at the tea house unexpectedly. She looked older, more fragile. her carefully maintained dignity showing cracks. Mrs. Hayashi served her tea without comment, then disappeared upstairs, leaving mother and daughter facing each other across scarred wood. "Your father doesn't know I'm here," her mother began. "He forbade me from contacting you, but I had to see for myself what you'd become." "And what have I become?" Michiko asked, keeping her voice level. Her mother studied her with complicated emotions, warring across her weathered face. "You look happy, tired and worn down by struggle, but happy. I didn't expect that. Because you assumed loving James would destroy me? Because I assumed any choice that brought such shame would hollow you out from inside." Her mother's hands trembled around the teacup. "But you seem more solid than before, like you finally grew bones after 43 years of being soft." Michiko felt unexpected tears threaten. "He asked me to marry him, to go to America." Her mother's expression shuttered. "I see. I'm considering it. I have nothing left here. No job prospects, no family who will acknowledge me, no future except serving tea to people who think I'm shameful. Maybe Philadelphia offers something better. Or maybe it offers different problems," her mother replied. "Harder problems. You'd be a foreigner in a country that treats its own dark-skinned citizens terribly. You think they'll treat a Japanese wife better?" "I don't know," Michiko admitted. "But at least I'd be choosing my problems instead of having them chosen for me." Her mother was silent for a long moment, staring into her tea like it might hold answers. Finally, she spoke so quietly, Michiko almost missed it. "I was 18 when I married your father. Arranged marriage, like all marriages then. I didn't love him initially. I learned to love him over time, which people said was proper and good. But sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I'd chosen differently. If I'd been brave enough to choose at all." "Mother, I'm not giving you permission," her mother interrupted firmly. "I'm not saying I approve or that your father will ever forgive you. But I am saying that perhaps there are worse things than choosing your own life, even if that choice looks like failure to everyone else." She left shortly after, paying Mrs. Hayashi for the tea despite protests, walking away without looking back. It wasn't reconciliation, wasn't blessing or approval, but it was something. A crack in the wall of judgment, acknowledgement that choosing herself didn't make Michiko entirely wrong. That evening, Michiko told James about the visit. They were sitting in her small room, his duffel packed and ready for departure in 4 days. He listened carefully, then asked the question that mattered most. "What do you want, Michiko? Not what's practical or safe or acceptable to others. What do you want?" Michiko looked at him. This man who'd seen her when she was invisible, loved her when she was convinced she was unlovable, offered her partnership when the world insisted she deserved nothing. She thought about 43 years of doing what was expected, and the year she'd spent doing what her heart demanded. She thought about survival versus living, about safety versus joy, about the woman she'd been and the woman she was becoming. "I want you," she said simply. "I want us. Whatever that means, whatever it costs." James's expression transformed, relief and love and fierce determination mixing together. "Then marry me. Tomorrow. We'll file the paperwork, start the immigration process, and figure out the rest as we go. It could take months for approval. You'll be in Philadelphia while I'm stuck here waiting. Then I'll write every day. I'll call when I can. I'll move heaven and earth to get you there." He took both her hands in his. "We've already survived separation and judgment, and everyone telling us this won't work. We can survive bureaucracy too." Michiko laughed through tears. "You make it sound simple." "It won't be simple, but it will be ours." They married 3 days later in a simple civil ceremony, witnessed by Mrs. Hayashi and the one-armed photographer who'd taken their portraits. The official performing the ceremony was American, clearly uncomfortable with the interracial union, but bound by duty to execute it properly. He rushed through the vows like they burned his tongue. Michiko wore her blue silk kimono. James wore his uniform. They exchanged rings, simple bands James had purchased from a street vendor, and kissed as husband and wife, while Mrs. Hayashi wept openly and the photographer captured the moment on film. It wasn't the wedding Michiko had imagined during her youth, when marriage still seemed possible, but it was real and chosen, and entirely hers. That made it perfect. James left for America 2 days after their wedding, the marriage certificate and immigration paperwork filed, but far from guaranteed. They stood at Tokyo Station surrounded by chaos, returning soldiers, displaced families, vendors hawking goods, the relentless machinery of a nation rebuilding itself. Michiko held his hand until the final boarding call, memorizing the feeling of his fingers laced through hers. "I'll write the moment I land," he promised, "and I'll call the consulate weekly to check on your application status. We'll make this work." "I know," Michiko said, trying to believe it. "Go. You'll miss your train." He kissed her one last time, deep and lingering and full of promises neither could guarantee. Then he boarded, finding a window seat so they could maintain eye contact until the train pulled away. Michiko stood on the platform, waving until the locomotive disappeared completely, becoming just another blur in Tokyo's constant motion. She returned to her room above the tea house, feeling the weight of what she'd done. Married to an American soldier, now permanently gone, waiting on immigration approval that might never come, entirely alone in a city that had already judged her harshly. The practical voice in her head, the one that had governed 43 years of her life, screamed that she'd made a catastrophic mistake. But the newer voice, the one James had helped her discover, whispered something different. She'd chosen love over fear. That was victory, regardless of outcome. The months that followed tested Michiko's resolve with brutal efficiency. The immigration paperwork moved with glacial slowness, each step requiring documentation she struggled to obtain, fees she barely afforded on tea-house wages, and interviews with officials who treated her like a criminal seeking undeserved access to American prosperity. James's letters arrived faithfully, but letters couldn't warm her bed during cold Tokyo nights or ease the loneliness that sometimes threatened to drown her. Work at the tea house became her anchor. Mrs. Hayashi taught her everything, not just service but the subtle art of reading customers, knowing when someone needed conversation versus silence, how to make weak tea taste substantial through perfect preparation. The old woman's arthritis worsened through winter, forcing her to rely increasingly on Michiko. "You're good at this," Mrs. Hayashi observed one quiet afternoon. "Better than I was at your age. You have empathy I had to learn through suffering." "I learned it through suffering too," Michiko replied, refilling their teapot. "Perhaps, but you transformed it into strength. Some people let suffering make them bitter. You let it make you kind." In February, 5 months after James's departure, Michiko's application faced unexpected complication. The American consulate required additional character references from Japanese citizens attesting to her moral fitness. But who would vouch for the woman everyone considered shameful? Her parents maintained absolute silence. Her former office colleagues actively despised her. The few neighbors who still acknowledged her existence did so with barely concealed contempt. Michiko sat in her room staring at the requirement form, feeling despair creep in around the edges. Maybe this was the universe's way of saying she'd reached too far, wanted too much. Maybe 43-year-old Japanese women didn't get American happy endings. Then Mrs. Hayashi knocked on her door carrying papers. "I wrote you a reference," she said simply, handing over 3 pages of careful Japanese script. "Detailing your character, your work ethic, your capacity for love despite hardship. It's not from someone important, but it's honest." Michiko read through tears, blurring the characters. Mrs. Hayashi had written about integrity and resilience, about a woman who'd survived war and judgment without losing her humanity. She'd written about daily kindnesses and quiet courage, about someone who deserved happiness she'd been denied too long. "Thank you," Michiko whispered. "This is more generous than—" "It's the truth," Mrs. Hayashi interrupted. "Truth shouldn't require thanks." The one-armed photographer provided another reference. Then, unexpectedly, the woman who'd visited months ago, Kenji Sato's sister, appeared at the tea house with a letter written on official company letterhead, vouching for Michiko's character, despite never having employed her directly. "My brother told me about your immigration troubles," she explained. "I run a trading company. My letterhead carries weight with American bureaucrats who value appearance over substance. Use it." 3 references. Barely adequate, but possibly enough. Michiko filed them with the consulate, paid another fee she couldn't afford, and returned to waiting. James called when international rates dipped low enough to justify the expense. His voice across the crackling connection sounded tinny and distant, but desperately real. "I miss you every day," he said. "My father asked when he gets to meet my wife. I told him soon, even though I don't know if that's true." "It's true," Michiko replied firmly. "It has to be." Spring arrived with cherry blossoms and an official letter from the American consulate. Michiko stood in her small room holding the envelope, too terrified to open it. If this was rejection, if her application had been denied, what then? Remain in Tokyo indefinitely married to a man she couldn't reach, seek annulment, accept that some dreams died despite your best efforts. Mrs. Hayashi appeared in the doorway. "Open it," she commanded gently. Not knowing is worse than bad news. Michiko tore the envelope with shaking hands and unfolded the single page inside. The bureaucratic language was dense and cold, but one word stood out with brilliant clarity: approved. Her visa had been granted. She could emigrate to the United States as James Crawford's legal spouse. Departure could be arranged within 6 weeks, pending final documentation. Michiko sat down abruptly, the letter fluttering to the floor. She'd won. Against all odds, despite every obstacle, she was going to Philadelphia. She was going to be with James. Mrs. Hayashi picked up the letter, read it quickly, and smiled with tears tracking down her weathered face. "You did it. You actually did it." The following weeks blurred together, final paperwork, selling her few possessions, saying goodbye to the tea house that had sheltered her during the hardest year. Mrs. Hayashi refused payment for the months Michiko couldn't work while processing immigration requirements, instead pressing money into her hands for the journey. "You gave me purpose when my sons died and I thought I had none left," the old woman said during their final evening together. "Watching you fight for your happiness reminded me why survival matters. Thank you for that gift." Michiko's parents never contacted her, never acknowledged her impending departure. She wrote them a final letter explaining when she was leaving, expressing love despite their rejection, and hoping someday they might understand. She received no response. On a mild April morning, Michiko boarded a ship bound for San Francisco, her worldly possessions condensed to a single trunk. She stood at the railing watching Tokyo's harbor recede, saying goodbye to the country that had birthed her, but never quite made space for who she actually was. The Pacific crossing took 2 weeks, 2 weeks of seasickness and uncertainty, of wondering if she'd made the right choice, of missing James so intensely it became physical pain. But as the California coast appeared on the horizon, Michiko felt something unexpected: hope. Not the fragile, frightened hope of someone grasping at impossible dreams, but the solid, earned hope of someone who'd fought for what she wanted and won. James met her at the dock, pushing through crowds with the same determined urgency he'd shown that first day in the basement, when he'd asked her to stay and help him. When he saw her, his expression transformed into pure joy. He swept her into his arms, lifting her off her feet despite customs officials watching with disapproval. "You're here," he kept repeating. "You're actually here." "I'm here," Michiko confirmed, laughing and crying simultaneously. "I'm home." Philadelphia proved challenging exactly as predicted. James's family was welcoming but cautious, not quite certain what to make of their son's Japanese wife. Neighbors stared. Strangers made comments. Restaurants sometimes refused service. The racism James had warned her about was real and painful and exhausting, but there was also James coming home every evening from the garage covered in grease, kissing her hello like she was precious. There was learning English more fluently, making friends with other military wives who understood complicated marriages. There was building a life together, small and imperfect, but entirely theirs. 10 years later, Michiko stood in their modest Philadelphia row house kitchen, making tea the way Mrs. Hayashi had taught her. She was 53 now, with silver threading through her hair and laugh lines around her eyes. James came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist and resting his chin on her shoulder. "Happy anniversary," he murmured. "Happy anniversary," she replied, leaning back into his warmth. They'd been married a decade, 10 years of challenges and joys, of building something real from what had started as impossible. Michiko had learned English, found work translating documents, made peace with her choices. Her parents had died without reconciliation, but she'd learned to carry that grief alongside her happiness. She'd lost everything to love James: country, family, the life she'd known for 43 years. And she'd gained everything that mattered: partnership, purpose, the radical joy of being seen and loved completely. She'd never stopped being the woman who missed her season. But she'd become something else too, the woman brave enough to create her own season, however late, however difficult, however impossible it seemed. And that, Michiko had learned, was the only season that mattered. Thank you so much for following Michiko and James's journey. If this story touched your heart, please leave a like, subscribe for more untold histories, and share your thoughts in the comments. What moment resonated most with you? Your engagement helps us continue bringing these powerful stories to light. Until next time, remember that it's never too late to choose your own happiness.